Thanks very much. This was very enjoyable. It was also holding up a mirror a little bit of some of my courses you survived. I have a I would like to put out a proposition to you, and then we can see how we are going to deal with questions from the room. But the big struggle we have in this school, and I think in many schools, is that students are overloaded with material, and that for every lack in curriculum, every white spot that we feel that students of ourselves that we do not really cover enough, we create another course or another seminar. When I was at the University of Virginia, I taught there in the 1980s. We had a Canon. The Canon was 750 buildings, which students had to know, and you needed to know, the recognizing date, place, and so on, architect. And when you became a new faculty member, then the Canon was given to you, and then the question is, which buildings should we add? But for every building that is going to be added, one has to be removed, which was the really interesting part of the exercise. So I came in and I put in, the crematorium in Auschwitz, and before I knew it, I was here. But the interesting thing, of course, is what's going to be removed. Yeah, and on what principles would we reorganize a curriculum? And what I think is the interesting question within that question is the following: that we would expect of both ourselves and our students to have a level of connoisseurship about ultimately architecture. And that connoisseurship, which I think is still, I would say, a fundamental skill that we would like to create, demands or requires or maybe suggests that we're looking of a particular building type, let's call it a modernist villa, that we would look at sufficient range of examples so that we actually can start to discuss it. So that I would say that if we're going to talk about Corpus Villa Savoy, we need to look at the Maison de Verre. We would like to have a Mies van der Rohe, and we would like maybe Loos, and maybe one or two other things. Which means that if we're going to talk about anything, we need not only to establish that this is important, but that there are enough kind of family members around that particular example to make actually discussion worthwhile. And so, given this proposition that we have a limited amount of time and energy, and that we cannot just add stuff to it, and that what we are going to preserve in our curriculum needs to be surrounded by, let's call it, a family of like buildings or like examples, how would you suggest that we start opening the curriculum, a Western curriculum, to other examples, to other discussions?
I'll jump in. And so I think the way to approach that is to keep the canon open and in flux, meaning that you don't have to teach the same things every year, that content can be flexible and can change. And so one year you can teach these 4 or 5 families, which is what I do in my Sacred Places course. I pick 4 or 5 religions, I focus on them one year, the next year I can switch out one, switch in another. And the students know, I'm very aware, I make the students aware that this is something that's in flux. So things that I'm teaching today I did not teach 5 years ago, and it's constantly in flux. So I think that there is a kind of a dynamic quality to the selection, A, and B, to what a family is. So just because you're talking about Villa Savoy does not mean you have to talk about those examples every single time. That can get changed up. Now, my answer to your question then requires that the teaching of cultural history is continuously in flux, and it is very dynamic and very demanding, and requires the professor sometimes to make leaps and bounds. As in, I'm making a stretch by including a building that just got finished construction last year and does not have a lot of documentation on it. But I am relying on my ability to teach analysis and critique and so forth, and the family, so that the connections can be made. So that would be my response to it, is that yes, you have to take something and put something else in, but it doesn't just happen once. It has to happen all the time, every day, and you have to think about it every year when you're teaching it. And amazingly, just listen to your students. It was my students who, after 1 year of teaching Sacred Places, asked me, when are we going to talk about ancient China and ancient Japan? And I thought, okay, thank you for the challenge. Taken.
I think it's actually I didn't show it. The last slide I had was called In Praise of Loose Cannons. So, cannons with one end. Because I have a very similar reaction. I think that somehow we need to attune what's happening in studio culture with what's happening in history theory classes a lot more closely so that these kind of swaps can be made. And I think that you talked about connoisseurship. I think there's different things that happen in the studio and that happen in the history class, at least in my experience. You know, the studio actually might be the place where you take a precedent and you take 5 villas and you figure out how they work together. And maybe, you know, you pull in some things that you've read in history class about what modernism is and what the modernist villa is and maybe what the Palladian villa was, and you put them together. But I think of history class as the place where you get the kind of wild ideas that don't seem to make sense in design culture and that you don't yet know how to integrate into the studio. So maybe those two things happen in different ways, right? I mean, I know I teach with some professors who are designers who've become historians because they got so fascinated with history, and I teach with some people who are trained historians and they never have been designers. And the approaches are very different, and it's kind of beautiful to have all of the synergy happening, but I think also to leave those two approaches as they are so that you can have someone who's looking at something with a completely formal interest or with a pragmatic interest, and then have another person who's looking at larger historical processes and can bring those into the conversation. So that was part of my response to that. I also am not sure that we need to have as many modernist villas because I think the students end up getting them in a lot of other ways. What I think we need to do is to bring students things that they couldn't get from anyone but a scholar, right? And even when that means that we have to empower them to become scholars, do research themselves, right? Like my grad students, I would always say, well, you have to do a research project on a building from a culture that you know nothing about. And so in the process of doing this research project, you have to confront how hard it is to even put together basic things. And just having that feeling, having that experience is something that you're going to take with you, even if you also, have a lot of knowledge that you bring from that, right? It's the simultaneity of not knowing and knowing how much more work there is to do, and then knowing how much you can figure out when you just look at a plan and write down what you see, right? Or when you just visit a building and take photographs, or when you start having to make collages of what you're seeing because you can't represent it through realistic means. So I think that variety of experience is what we need to preserve. But the buildings themselves, I'm not so sure about.
Yeah. Now, just before I open it to the room, I was very much influenced by Aldo van Eyck, who was an enormous figure when I was young in the Netherlands, and I taught with him also for some time. Aldo was very interesting. I mean, it's very interesting actually to look at his life also in relationship to what you've been discussing about. That he practiced his whole life with his wife, Honey. They were students together, and of course her name only started appearing as a co-author on the buildings very much in the last 2 decades of them collaborating together. This is in the late mid-70s onwards that it was acknowledged. Aldo was very clear that we look at buildings for different reasons, and that there's a reason to look at the let's call it the canon, the Western canon, for understanding the idea of permanence, for example, and the ideal of permanence, and we look at in this case we called it an anthropological tradition, which he was very much interested in, of course, in his own work, to actually understand how architecture works at the level of the individual. And that there is this conversation going on. And I thought that the clarity with which he presented that actually made it possible for, let's call it for a moment, the West and the other traditions to be in a conversation, because he had a theoretical position about what each could contribute. I don't know if you want to respond to that, but...
I do.
Yeah. Okay. Yes.
Well, I mean, for a long time, I had a colleague who taught Dogen Architecture only through Van Eyck, and it would make me want to tear my hair out because Van Eyck's version of it is beautiful, it's amazing, but it's not all of Dogen Architecture; it's Van Eyck's take on it. But I do think that there's a way in which we need to not just think about the West and outside the West as being opposites, but to think about all of the lines that run through them. I mean, there's no disconnection after 1500. There's especially none at the time that Aldo van Eyck is working. And so even though, he went to study a culture that he was not familiar with initially, or he didn't grow up with, there's a way in which there were already, material links between Europe and Mali, that were quite strong, patterns of colonialization and expropriation. And so to not understand the work in those terms as well seems to me to be really troublesome. So like in our survey, we just realized that like our students didn't necessarily know about Bretton Woods Accords and about the beginnings of neoliberalism and about the impacts of colonialism and where they happened. So we just had like our first week as a history seminar, like straight up history, where we said, all right, so this country colonized this country, this is where all the money went, and blah, 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 and gave them a framework. And then, when we do get to Aldo van Eyck, we can then say, well, right. He's engaging these differences in a way that matches geopolitics and in a way that works against them too in some very creative ways. And so none of this is to minimize the importance of Van Eyck's work, which I adore as well, but to ask for us to put it in a different framework.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard sometimes when you've studied and seen so much to want to give everything all at once to your students and want to share everything, and it is such a challenge to edit and select what you're going to expose your students to, and it's a matter of curation. So what do I curate this year? And can I rely on this skeleton framework? As long as I'm telling my students this is a skeleton, this is a framework, these are examples, there's so much more. What is the message I'm giving through my curation? That is my critique, right? There's an established canon that exists in the West, but the West is not the only thing that exists in the world. We know this. This is the reality. And so I think that by curating a diversity of voices, even if they are not as clear as, say, someone who's processed them as Van Eyck, but if we are to look at the primary sources of a particular culture and understand it, I think those are the tools, the gifts that we can give to our students. It is through the gifts I got from the University of Waterloo Cultural History program that I read Book of the Dead, that I read the Kojiki texts, that I read the Agana Sutta. I was never taught any of these here. I processed them. And I think that it is a lost opportunity if we are not exposing our students to complex other materials from other cultures and removing that kind of filter or that Western lens in between, as clean and as beautiful as it may be according to one experience we had. So it may be rougher and raw. I just had my students last week read a few chapters from Book of the Dead. The hieroglyphics are underneath it. The English translation is above it. They were tearing their hair out saying, what the hell are you making us do in first year? Like, no, if we don't go through this, the 42 negative confessions, you will never understand any of the buildings I'm going to explain, right? And so I think that it's hard because when you select things, you're losing so much else. But you're gaining by having this diversity. That is my argument. So anyway.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes.
Hi, thank you for your great talk. I have like about 1 million questions to ask, but I'm going to try to just go one. A lot of the questions that come up when you talk about, especially in the canon, play on these dichotomies, like how much you balance between theory and how much you practice it in school, like how much you show a survey of a whole bunch of stuff, and how much you go in depth with one thing. One of the things that comes up constantly is about how much a professor may or may not know about the topic. And you brought it up, like the idea that like you can't really translate certain things if you don't understand the culture, but at the same time, we are demanding faculties who predominantly are white to diversify curricula, and we're asking them to teach themselves things that they're not familiar with. And that is sort of line of defense that everybody kind of falls on. Oh, I don't know about this. That's not my specialization. I'm not going to teach it. So how do you walk that line of demanding people to kind of teach themselves and come teach it to the class? Because they obviously have skills and analytic skills and practicing that. And then how do you also make sure that they're not appropriating material? And I understand that part of this is a matter of time. Like by time, the faculty are going to start getting more diverse. But and we have to look at this as a short-term plan and a long-term plan, but how do you start thinking about it today?
Well, there are a lot of very diverse faculty members, and someone's ethnicity or race doesn't necessarily correspond to always what they know either, right? There are a lot of people who study other cultures than what they come from. But I would just, again, shout out the Global Architectural History Teaching Collaborative, which any faculty member can apply to join, and I think they're approved, as this incredible resource for teaching things that you don't know. Because basically, the people who are experts in that have packaged for everyone else key texts, key articles, key images, and so I don't have to spend hours and hours looking for, like the image that I showed of those berets, that is Mark Jarzenbeck's image. I didn't have to redraw that image, I didn't have to go looking for it, but it fit into what my own narrative of this thing that I discovered from my own research. And then it led me to other research, which led me to come to slightly different conclusions than the ones that Professor Jarzenbeck presented me with. So I think it's really through things like that professors can begin to do this, but very few people are motivated to do it, and frankly, I don't know, it's maybe not so much the case in Canada as it is in the US, I'm not sure how it compares. A lot of professors in the United States are adjuncts, and they're not paid to go off and do research, right? The culture of doing research and understanding other cultures is really grossly underfunded in North America. And so I think there are structural problems to address too, as well as, more sort of simple finding ones and ones at a time. The SSHRC is great, though. They funded aggregate, so we wouldn't exist without them.
Nice.
Yeah.
My answer, it's a great question, thank you. And you pointed out some real issues in academia in addressing this. I would say the beginning of that would be that kind of filter, the sieve. So what sieve do you choose? And what material am I going to kind of take through that sieve? So when I taught your cultural history course 5 years ago, the sieve I used was myself, right, a woman. So I pulled out Hildegard, didn't have to invent her. She was there, and we read her. I pulled out Ibn Jubayr, didn't have to invent him. He was there. So it was just the sieve of material that I knew, and what filters I was going to use to select. So that would be the first thing, is what precedents can I bring to the fore that maybe were not taught by people previous to me or those who taught me. So that's the first thing. The second thing is I take the challenge. So when after the first year I taught Sacred Places and I was approached by students, I did spend the year developing one lecture. So it is 1 or 2 lectures I spend on each religion and course. I spent the year researching. Fred Thompson was a great help. And I read the Agana Sutta, I read the Kojiki texts, I used materials from my previous trips to Japan, and I did put together a lecture. I remember being very nervous as I presented it because it is not one that I am deeply familiar with, but one I do know. And I was really pleased with the response to the lecture, right? Students volunteering and giving me and helping and sharing. And so it was like I tried the first step, and it's a place of vulnerability when a professor is giving a lecture about content that they're not deeply familiar with for decades and decades and decades. But it's really exciting for me to learn while I'm teaching. So I just take it as a challenge. And I'm usually full disclosure with my students about my familiarity with something, and I think that the primary gesture of exposing and discussing, and we have the tools to be able to critique. Right, that's the gift, right? Is to be able to critique things almost in a way that's comparable. So that's right.
Yeah, just to add, the famous saying by a great philosopher of science is that, people don't change their mind, they just die. And, and the reality is that, that of course change, I think the problem is a little bit that if we're looking at the university as an institution, the typical teaching career of a professor, when you get appointed in your early 30s, would be a 30, 40-year career. And that in earlier times, that might have been a good stretch to basically teach whatever you had learned, whatever you believed in, and it wasn't completely irrelevant by the time that you retired. And then academic freedom protected your turf. And academic freedom, I think, is still very important. Now, of course, these cycles of change, as represented by the students, are shorter. And so the potential irrelevance of a professor teaching from the, let's say, from the old idea of what would be relevant or not, is greater. And you know, I must say that I also try to change. But it's not easy. It's also very exciting at the same time. I mean, I'm reading material I've never read before. You know, I'm teaching Hildegard also now. And
Finally, oh my God.
It's-
Let me just quote Robert Jan, 2013, comes up to me, looks at my syllabus, sees Hildegard, sees Ibn Jubayr, sees all these readings that have never been on 246 before. Tammy, have you reinvented the course?
Yeah.
I'm like, Robert Jan, I did not make any of this up.
But Tammy, I also told you in 2013 that I already taught the Mukaddima in the
You did.
mid-1990s.
You did.
Yeah, I did the whole
You did.
Mukaddima, all 600 pages, and I got a revolt from the students because this enormous treatise on Arab culture was too long. So, and there was no short version of it. So, I mean, you have to give me a little bit of there. Okay, good. Another question, observation.
Oh my God. Okay, so, yeah, we decided, for example, Iceland, we decided a week. I'd done the research in the summer. I did full disclosure to anyone interested in the studio, the costs with respect to researching flights and accommodation. Very first class, we sat round table, we booked the flights that sitting. They helped find the hostel that we stayed at. I set up a dinner schedule. Everything was, every piece of food that they ingested, they had to make. We were not going to be eating out. I also set a pretty rigorous schedule that started 5 or 6 a.m. and ended around 11 p.m. every day of the buildings that we were going to see in Iceland. We visited in the week 12 buildings. We did the entire south coast, and then we had visits at the School of Architecture and Olafur Eliasson studio. We did that in 5.5 days, and we had a day and a half of free time to follow up with what we were interested in. So, I mean, I took the role as pedagogue, and I did the same when we went to Turkey. Ask anyone who did the Cappadocia-Istanbul trip with me. I did the same thing. I spent an enormous amount of time researching what can be done, the Google Maps, everything that I could find to help me, curated that, but full disclosure to my students, and was very open to their critique and feedback to the whole plan of the week, so that they would own it. It was really important that I put the time in to imagine it, but that they would put the time in and own how that was going to be. And it was really important to me to make this as frugal as possible, because I really wanted them to be able to enjoy the experience as much as they can. And I know how difficult, from personal experience, how difficult it can be to travel but want to see a lot.
Can I would disagree with something. That's a question. Travel slowly. Travel slowly, because what you just outlined was 12 cities in 12 days or something. It wasn't really. It's much more serious than that.
No, it was 12 buildings.
But the proposition is 12 buildings in 12 days might be very good, but one building for a month might be better.
Sure.
Because the proposition is we skate over all of it, all the time. 15 seconds a screen. Travel slowly, slow down, write about it, look at it, draw it.
Just visiting the whole family. Just visiting the whole family.
Oh, I know, no, the proposition is,
We haven't
my
been-
advice back there would be one place for a month.
Let me modify my answer. Figure out how much money you have. Base your decisions on that. We had 1 week. I had 12 students. Each of them was to take 2 buildings. My rule was we had to see all the buildings, but then they had to go back on their free time to investigate further, and that they were responsible in depth for the representation of 2 buildings, not all 12. FYI. But yes, my advice would be figure out how much money you have and how much you can make it stretch.
I mean, I'm wondering, like, I'm just mindful, Tanya said, like, you're checking time, right? And I said yes, but I'm sure time has been like.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I do have to go.
I'm really sorry to actually have to bring this conversation.
Sorry.
to a close. It was really incredibly inspiring. I thank you both and Robert and all the questions that you've brought. I mean, I want to continue this conversation. I just found it really interesting in the sense, like, even the non-Western course, like, I think what we're trying to see is like when is it flex, I mean, it's not defined at what it is not, but actually when you can actually look in, you know, everything in the positive, is maybe the ambition here. So thank you both for